This case that we have before you, it's a double homicide. It's in a hotel room. We have a male victim found on the bed. He's deceased. We have a female victim that is on the floor between the bed and the kitchen, or not the kitchen, but the bathroom. What you will be seeing me do is, as I go through this, I've got a cameraman here who, as I'm just talking generally, will probably be scanning the space, but when I point out certain areas within this space, he's going to zoom in on those areas so you can see exactly what I'm seeing within this crime scene. In order to be able to understand what happened, you have to understand what happened to the victims. This is where the autopsy comes into play. In this case here, this is a mock crime scene. This is just a created space. The victims will be processed at the crime scene, then they go to the coroner's office and a pathologist will do the autopsy. That is critical information for me. The pathologist's findings allows me to now take a look at, okay, I've got blood patterns in the scene. How am I going to attribute the creation of these blood patterns relative to the bleeding injuries that were documented at autopsy? So the first step in terms of assessing a case is saying, okay, what happened to the victims? In this particular case, we have a male victim. He's laying face down. He's got a single blow to the back of his head. At autopsy, that single blow is consistent with something similar to a hatchet or an axe. Right next to his body, we have a hatchet. It's been laid there by the offender. Now, if we were to take a look at this right now, we have the blow to the back of the head, and if we take a look at the headboard, you'll notice that there's no blood spatter on the headboard. Can somebody tell me why there isn't any blood spatter on that headboard?
Because it's not where he was struck.
It's not where he was struck. One of the things to understand about blood patterns, especially when you're dealing with spatter, spatter is created when you have impact to a pooled blood source. You have to have that pooled blood source. If I were to take a baseball bat and strike somebody in the head as hard as I could, am I going to produce blood spatter? No. Probably could kill the person. But once that person's down and I strike again in that same spot, now you get the blood spatter, right? So when you see a spatter pattern from an impact to a pooled blood source, minimally, how many blows occurred in order to produce that spatter pattern? At least 2. When you look at our male victim, he's got a single blow to the back of his head with a hatchet. Fatal injury, he's deceased, laying face down on the bed, but no blood spatter. It's easily accounted for. It's very critical to understand that as I go through this, that when you start talking about reconstructing the events at a crime scene, you can only reconstruct those events that left interpretable evidence. You imagine, basically all of you guys coming into this room today is like a person who's entering a house to commit a crime. And then you walk through the space, you sit down on the chairs, you get up and you walk out. How can I, as a crime scene investigator, coming in hours after that, reconstruct your movements through this space? Not really. However, if you do something that leaves evidence of an action that you took, now I can actually see that and interpret it. And so I liken this to sitting in a dark room watching a play, right? And you can't see anything going on on stage. And then all of a sudden there's a strobe light that goes off, and you see the actors on stage for that brief split second, but then it goes dark again. That is what happens in crime scene reconstruction. So when I am looking at blood patterns up on the wall, that's where I've got that strobe light going off saying, I've got this type of pattern that occurred in this space. I can interpret that. But do I have evidence to show me what happened before or after that particular action occurred within the commission of the crime? So what you're going to see as I walk through this is starting to interpret the events based on the blood patterns. Now, we've talked about the male and his autopsy result. It looks like he's probably face down, whether he's asleep or he has been ordered on the bed, and a single blow to the back of his head. At this point, we have no other movements, no other blood patterns in this particular scenario from the male victim. All the other blood, based on the forensic testing that I'm just going to say has been done at this point, comes back to the female victim. So now we have blood patterns distributed throughout this room. In order to understand those blood patterns, we have to understand, well, what bleeding injuries does she have? So now, this is again where the pathologist's findings become critical. Turns out that our female victim in this case has multiple stab wounds. She's got defensive injuries to her hands and her arms. She's got stab wounds to the back of her head as well as her upper back. And then she has stab wounds to her upper chest and neck area. So she's got a lot of bleeding injuries going on. Now, when you take a look at those injuries, imagine, most of you have probably cut a finger in your life, right? And so now you've got a bleeding injury in which blood is dripping. What happens when you fling your arm while that blood is dripping? You get cast-off patterns. However, these stab wounds to the head, the upper body, you really can't fling your upper body, but they're going to bleed. You're going to get saturated clothing. So when you get pressed up against a surface, you could have what are called contact transfers. If you have a lot of blood in your hair, you get these hair wipes, and you can actually see the hair outlines. So you can start to use these blood patterns in order to position the victim at various points during her interaction with the offender. In this case, if we were to come around, we're going to start sort of at the end and work our way backwards. We have the female victim laying face up. She's been covered by a sheet from the bed. She's got numerous stab wounds to her upper chest, her neck area, and we have spatter immediately above her. What does that tell me about what's going on with her laying here? Anybody want to answer that question?
She was fighting back.
Say that again?
She was fighting back.
She's fighting back. Now, we've got her laying down, and there's no question she's fighting in this scenario. But at this point, what I've got is I've got stab wounds to the upper chest and neck, and I've got the spatter that's going up onto that doorway immediately above her. This is showing that she's receiving multiple stab wounds at that location while she's down. And what you get is you get a combination of cast off from the knife as it gets bloody over and over again. On the upswing, you get blood drops being cast off. But also, once you get that pooled blood source and that knife is going in, you can get small amount of spatter as a result. The other thing you have to take into account is human anatomy. When you start penetrating, for example, the lungs with a knife, and you start getting blood inside the lungs, inside the trachea, and that victim is trying to breathe, you get expiratory patterns. And so now you start to see fine droplets being deposited up above where the victim is at, as well as raining down on her. Absolutely horrific to think what these victims would go through under those circumstances. Now, working our way backwards. She's down. It appears that she's receiving multiple stab wounds at this position. This is where she dies, right? She is no longer moving after this point. But we have blood stains all around. In fact, on the bed, what we can see are her blood based on DNA testing with spatter patterns on the headboard as well as on this side of the bed. Then we have an area in which we have large transfers with hair wipes. Where's that blood coming from? Back of her head. What is this telling us about her interaction with the offender in this little tiny corner between the table and that wall? So she's down on the bed. It appears that she starts receiving some bleeding injuries while she's on the bed. Now, as the bleeding starts to basically saturate her clothing, saturate her hair, she now has a struggle going on in that corner. Yet you see the differences. We have some transfers, large blood patterns up high and down low. It's showing her change of position. There's a combat going on between the offender and the victim at this location. She's up, she's down. We have a dripped blood trail on the carpet down here, kind of coming out towards this chair. We have blood smears on the top of the table, as well as handprints, bloody handprints on the wall. There's a lot of information going on within this very confined area. Our offender is interacting with our victim, but he's struggling to take control. She's up, she's down, she's trying to get away. She has defensive injuries, incisive wounds to her hands as she's grasping at surfaces or grabbing the wall. She's leaving blood transfers. So these are those strobe lights that I told you about. You can start to piece together the events and possibly the logical progression from the time that she's receiving bleeding injuries when she's on the bed, as she's struggling to get away from the offender and fighting with the offender, to ultimately she's laying down and she loses her life on the floor. So that's how, from just looking at blood patterns, you can start to reconstruct activities within the crime scene. And quite frankly, blood patterns are one of the best forms of evidence to reconstruct those types of events. You know, a little goofy thing that I do. You know, standing in the shower, you got the steam shower going on, and the glass on the shower doors are all steamed up. You got water on your hands, just sit there and start flicking the water against those shower doors to see what kind of patterns you create. And obviously water is different than blood. Blood is more viscous, but you know what? You start to see how you can change the patterns just by doing that simple experiment. So how many people, the next time you take a shower, so when you get in this space, and I'm going to contaminate this crime scene a little bit, I'm going to move this out to here. This is a trash can that ended up having some papers that are burned. When crime scene investigators first respond out to a crime scene, one of their priorities is to actually photograph the crime scene as it is at the time that they walk in. Law enforcement is trained that once they've determined that there's no other lives at risk, this is now a homicide scene, they lock it down and preserve it in its native state. However, the offender left, probably from this case, many, many hours before. I need to know what alterations have occurred to this crime scene between the time that the offender left and the time that the photographs were taken in that crime scene. Imagine paramedics thinking that they have living victims in this space. Are they concerned at all about the physical evidence or about crime scene reconstruction? Not at all. Paramedics will come in here, they'll throw everything out of the way, they'll turn the victims' bodies over, they'll check for vital signs. They will take a scene. It could be a homicide scene. They can make it look like a suicide, or a suicide scene and make it look like a homicide, because their goal is to preserve life, and you can't blame them for that. At the same time, you have to understand, well, who found the bodies? Was it loved ones? Did they do anything to alter the scene? Sometimes they'll come up and hug their loved one that's now deceased at the crime scene. Initial responding officers will come in, and they will change the crime scene. So when I am first digging into the crime scene aspect, I have to know who found the body, what did the first responders do, and I have to take into account those potential alterations. In this particular case, this scene was discovered because a smoke detector went off. So now you got the smoke alarm going on, and you have the hotel manager coming in, and the trash can, which was alight, set on fire, was right up against the drapes. So of course that person moves this trash can away so the hotel doesn't burn down. But it becomes important to understand that you have that kind of alteration. Now, when you take a look at this crime scene, what kind of stands out to you in that something that the offender did? I heard it. Victim number one. What is that offender trying to tell us?
There'll be a victim number two.
Say it again?
There'll be more victims.
There'll be more victims. He is now saying, I'm a serial killer, right? Victim number one, there's going to be more. And it's written in such a way to be very apparent to anybody entering this space. Does anybody see any contradictions going on in this space?
Why are there two?
Well, why not victim two? Okay, and that is a good point. Because imagine an offender coming in and he wants to kill this couple. Part of what has to occur is taking a look at the offender's behaviors with each of the victims in this crime scene. So with the male, in essence, you have single blow to the back of the head. Male is taken out, offender drops the hatchet. Now the offender is turning the attention to the female. Is the offender showing a lot of emotions, a lot of anger towards the male? Very clinical. This was an elimination. You eliminate the threat, right? Also tells me that there's probably not a personal connection between the offender and the male. This was literally just to it's almost an MO thing. Get the male out of the way so I can now turn my attention to the female. Notice where victim number one is written relative to the female's body. Is that significant? Is victim number one the male? Victim number one is the female. What does it mean when victims are covered up? Something personal, right? There could be something personal, or they could be showing remorse. They're having a hard time looking at what they did. That's very, very significant in terms of assessing the offender's relationship to the victim. The male's not covered up. He's exposed. He's got the blow to the back of his head, but you know what? There doesn't appear to be a personal connection between the offender and that male victim. But there does seem to be a personal connection with the offender and the female. When you're dealing with predatory types of offenders, you rarely see them cover their victims up. Oftentimes, what you see, especially victims that they are taken into their vehicle, let's say the sex workers that they end up taking into their vehicle, killing somewhere, and then they discard their bodies on the side of a road or somewhere else. The only covering up they do is to try to hide the body. There isn't that personal connection where they're trying to show, I can't look at this, and they don't want to see it anymore. But generally, predators are not going to cover their victims up like what we see in this particular case. Sequencing is also a big deal when you start talking about crime scenes. And sequencing can occur when you're taking a look at how blood patterns overlap with each other, or just common sense stuff. So maybe if we take a look at the shoes on the ground over here, what are we seeing? We've got a pair of men's shoes, and then we have a wallet. The wallet has been emptied out. What does that tell us about the sequence of events? Shoes were there first, the wallet was emptied out, placed on top after that. When you start to see items being stolen, like money, jewelry, does that necessarily mean that the crime itself is absolutely financially motivated? No. It can be due to financial opportunity. The offender has taken control of the situation. He sees a source of cash, goes, I'm going to take that. See it all the time. But it also could be, I'm going to make it look like something it's not. I want people coming in to think I came here because I wanted money. So there's a form of what we call staging. Now, from a sequencing standpoint, remember we had that trash can with paper that was set on fire. What's the offender trying to do with that? Go ahead.
Destroy evidence?
Okay. So, if he's trying to destroy evidence, is he setting this place on fire early in this event or towards the end?
I'd say afterwards.
It's probably his last action, right? When does he write victim number 1? Before then. And he ends up using the victim's bra, and if we can see on the floor over here, probably took the victim's bra out of the suitcase, dipped it in her own blood, and then wrote victim number 1 up here. We have a chair that's been pulled back at the foot of the bed. We have a man's wallet, keys, a cell phone that are on the ground, with the wallet being on top of the shoes. Appears that maybe the offender possibly sat down in that chair while he's going through stuff. He's not doing that probably while the victims are alive. So it's sequencing events. And then at the very end, he is now writing, or he's now trying to burn the place down. So let's think about this for a second. And now we're kind of digging into the behavioral aspects of what's going through the offender's mind. He does a clinical kill of the male, and then he goes to interact with the female. The female puts up a fight. And it's probably a much bigger fight than what was expected based on the movements of her, the bleeding of her, and where she ultimately ends up. You think that the offender gets rattled as a result of that? These guys, I mean, they talk about being cold-blooded killers, but the reality is they're going into these cases, they're nervous, they're stimulated. They are amped up. And when things go sideways on them, some of them do not respond very well to that. And so they get frazzled. And at the end, that's when they start making some of these mistakes that become interpretable. So if this guy is trying to portray himself as this blossoming serial killer, victim number one, and he's displaying that for everybody who's entering this room in plain sight, what about covering that victim up? What do you think about that? Anybody have thoughts?
He was related to this person?
He was what?
Related to this person?
He's related
Maybe it was
to the
his
person?
wife?
Or he has like a personal connection because of the covering up. But what about victim number one? I'm a serial killer versus, we have somebody down here.
I don't think that any of it is real. I think it's all staged. I think the whole victim thing is...
Okay.
I think it's about killing that person, and the victim, the serial killer thing is just the staged.
A staging. So what does it mean when somebody stages? I briefly talked about that. We have some people back there. That is a very important concept to understand, and it's very real, and it happens more frequently than what you realize.
So it's making the crime scene look like it's something other than it is, and like the contradictory evidence of victim number one saying, I want everyone to see this, there's going to be a number two, versus setting the hotel room on fire, destroying everything. What's that with?
It's contradiction, right?
Right.
So he's trying to make it look like victim number one, I'm a serial killer, yet the victim is covered up, showing sort of that personal connection. Appears to be contradictory. Anytime I walk into a scene and I start to see something that is contradictory, that's where I have to step back and go, okay, I need to look at that more closely, because I might be having an offender who is staging. He's trying to make the crime look like something it's not. Now, why does somebody stage a crime scene?
Well, because they don't want to be caught, but because they want to obviously send you in a different direction.
Yes.
And one of the things I wanted to say, and I'm not sure how what you're saying is he wants the place to burn down, but to me, I want to say that it may be that he knows it's not going to burn down, because if it does, then victim number one on that door is useless.
Well, I think in part you've got a good observation there. But first with the staging, it's all about misdirection. And anytime somebody stages a crime scene, they're trying to push the investigation as far away from them as possible. So if he's writing victim number one, I'm a serial killer, is he? He's betraying himself by covering the victim, saying, I can't stand to look at what I just did to somebody I know. That's a good question. How do we know he's a man? I'm going to address that. But first, let's address the fire. So we're seeing he took the time to write this victim number one up on the wall. He wants people to see that. But if the fire is successful, are people going to see that? Contradiction.
I would check the relationships of each of these and see if it's they have another relationship going on and caught him in the hotel.
So victimology.
Yes.
Victimology is huge. And that's part of the investigative phase in terms of when you start assessing the crime scene. Of course, part of any investigation is knowing who the victims are. That's all right. We're all having fun here, right? But knowing who the victims are and what's going on in their lives, who they're interacting with, becomes very, very important. And this is where interpreting the crime scene becomes significant. Because when you first come in, the entire universe is at your disposal in terms of suspect pool. And you become very ineffective and very inefficient if you don't have a direction that you think you should be going down. But when you interpret this crime scene, and as I'm looking at this crime scene, I'm seeing the contradiction. I'm seeing, ooh, serial killer, but no. I'm remorseful about what I did to the female victim. Even though I took the time to write victim number 1, I want to burn this place down because I don't want to get caught. I want to destroy the evidence. But then I'm eliminating the message that I want to send to the people who are responding.
That's where the sequencing comes in, because maybe they started the fire and it went X or something, and then they're like, this isn't working.
Right.
So how do you know which happened first?
So the question is this where sequencing comes into play? And yes, absolutely. But sometimes you cannot sequence things definitively based on physical evidence, but you end up using common sense. What is the logical progression? Remember, the hotel manager came into the room and the trash can was on fire, right? So that appears to be the last thing this offender did. He's trying to burn this place down. He does not want to be caught. And I'm using the term he very generically right now. So with this contradiction, now investigatively, from a behavioral standpoint, I'm going, you know what? If this guy's trying to force me to take a look at, I'm this serial predator and this was just a random attack, going, no, it's not. He has a personal relationship with this woman. Who is in her past? What is the relationship between her and the male victim? And starting to assess the victimology, and I could potentially narrow down the suspect pool that would fit. Now, one of the aspects about this case, and this is an unusual case because we have 2 different weapons being used. We have a hatchet that was used on the male that was discarded, but then we have a knife that the offender took away that was used on the female. Somewhat unusual to see 2 weapons being introduced by the offender within the same crime scene, but it does happen. But notice how much movement the female victim was able to do within this space. And granted, it's a small space, but she's moving around. What does that tell us about maybe the physical capabilities between the female and the offender?
What happened is he walked in with the hatchet. The assailant, whatever, walked in with the hatchet, took out the male victim while he was sleeping because he was going to, he was out for the water.
Here, we have a mic right here for you.
He took out the male because the male could defend himself. And then the female was actually the one that he wanted to see, was actually
The target?
the target, yeah.
Okay. So he's eliminating the male, the larger threat, but now he's turning his attention to the female, but the female's able to fight.
He took out the man because the man could fight back. Whenever he started fighting the woman, they're more evenly matched. She could get away when they were one-on-one. So it might be a female offender who's trying to take out the woman, or a smaller, weaker man. It's not someone real strong.
So that's one of those things. Very good. That's one of those things that it's very subjective, but it's something that I am constantly evaluating. You see this over and over again with crimes against women. When you have a very physically dominant male or offender, generally you see that female basically being contained. Once the offender has interacted with that female, that interaction stays in that spot. But when you start to see combat situations where now the victim is able to move and seemingly able to get away at times, and the offender is constantly struggling to contain the victim, now you go, okay, these two combatants appear to be relatively equal in terms of their physical capabilities. Can't say what gender the offender is, but you can start to say, you know what, I'm not dealing with a 6'5", 320-pound NFL lineman with a 5'2" petite female. I'm dealing with an offender that is probably physically on par with the victim. And you have to also take into account the victim psychology in this moment. She's realizing her life's at risk. You have the fight or flight kind of adrenaline kicking in. You get the super strength. You know, there is stuff that also impacts how this interaction goes. But when you start looking at all the cases, and I've seen a lot of these cases, and you start correlating who the offender is physically relative to the victim, you can start to see how that influences the dynamics at the crime scene. I have a case, it's a very high-profile case, in which a relatively well-known media, you know, kind of a talking head in the media, his wife was killed in a mansion that was, or in a trailer home while their mansion was being built in my jurisdiction. I walk into that crime scene, and it was a crime scene that basically flowed through this entire living space. This woman struggled, and this struggle occurred for a long period of time. And I told the investigators, the primary investigators on the case, I said, this is not a robust offender. This is somebody who is going to be relatively small and relatively weak. And it turned out to be a teenage boy living in the area. So you can get insight based on assessing that type of movement pattern.